Yeah, okay. And Shelley, when you stand, you have to stand right here. Because your microphone for telehealth is in here. So make sure you stand here and move around. Okay. Did you say? Good morning. I guess we'll get started. Big crowd this morning. That's right. Yeah, for the sake of time, we'll get started. So I think I know almost everybody here, but in case you don't know who I am, my name is Kelsey. I'm on the Manitoba FASD team, and this is Shelley. She's the speech language pathologist on the team. So our objectives for today are to briefly review the criteria for an FASD diagnosis based on the Canadian Diagnostic Guidelines. We'll look at some of the literature on sensory, motor, and language skills in preschoolers with prenatal alcohol exposure. We'll discuss our findings related to those three areas based on our research that we've recently done. And then we'll review the combined clinical significance of these assessments for children with PAE. And then we'll discuss how our findings can enhance the Canadian Diagnostic Guidelines for preschoolers. So we are just a very large, comprehensive, multidisciplinary team, and not everybody is even in that picture, but that's our, and we have new members of our team that aren't in there as well. So just to briefly summarize, what is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? So FASD is an umbrella term, and it describes the range of neurodevelopmental effects that can occur in a baby who has been exposed to alcohol during pregnancy. There are Canadian national guidelines for the diagnosis of FASD, and it is a really complex medical diagnosis, which we'll kind of go into a little bit in the following slides. So these are the guidelines that were revised in 2015, and you can see that it is for across the lifespan, but for the purpose of this morning, we're going to focus on preschoolers specifically. So in 2015, they expanded the consideration for infants and young children, and they noted the importance of early indicators of FASD in young children. So things like infant state regulation, negative temperament, poor eating, sleeping, and alertness, and irritability. They recognize that it's a multifactorial approach, and there's many features that impact neurodevelopment and behavior, things like trauma, including intergenerational trauma, attachment, toxic stress, and it also recognizes the impact of other neurobiological systems that can impact someone's occupational performance, like sensory processing and other stressors. So when we look at early symptoms of PAE and FASD in infancy, we see things like excessive arousal and the feeding and sleeping that we just spoke about. They often have minimal vocalizations. They can start having a short attention span, developmental delays. You might start seeing some abnormal movement patterns, some different sensory responses. And then all these symptoms that you can see in infancy can worsen in time. You can see them more in preschoolers. And then additionally, as they get older, then you can start to see more hyperactivity, like once they're starting to move around and play a little bit more attention issues. Their minimal vocalizations are turning into more specific language and communication delays. They might have more aggression. Their social skills and play skills might be more compromised. They might have some difficulty in memory as well. So the preschool assessment itself is multifaceted and uses a variety of measures and approaches. We use an ecological frame of reference, considering the child in a variety of different contexts like their home and preschools, communities, and all those different environments that play a role on their development. It's a comprehensive multidisciplinary assessment with SLP, OT, social work, psychology, geneticists. There's a lot of people that are contributing to the assessment of a preschooler. It's strength-based and it informs early intervention strategies and referrals. So why do we see preschoolers? The impact of their early years is really formative, and just as we spoke about in the previous slide, biology, genetics, and many different environments and cultures play a role in their development. But Angele et al. In 2007 nicely defined child development as the ordered emergence of interdependent skills of sensory motor, cognitive language, and social emotional functioning. And there's a really limited body of research on the preschool profile for FASD, but there is an extensive body of research on school age and adolescence. So we're quite excited about our research being able to contribute to that body of literature, or start it anyways. So understanding the preschool profile will contribute to understanding and identifying the preschoolers' presentations and their individual profiles. It'll support early diagnoses. It can facilitate early intervention, prevent some of those secondary occupational performance issues and defensive behaviors that can develop over time. And it can inform your intervention planning and your adaptations, trying to create a better fit between the child and their environment. And so whether we give a diagnosis or not, but that assessment process can really guide your intervention, because their strengths and their areas of impairment will look a little bit different than some of the other kids on your caseload. So this is a nice slide by Dr. Hanlon-Dearman that looks at the developmental steps of sensory motor, language, and cognition, and looking at how the synapses that are formed based on brain development are really dependent on early experiences. And while this is a very simple graph, it shows you that there's points in time when a child is developing, that there's different systems that are developing at different times. So our assessment of a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 17-year-old will look very different, and it should look really different because their brain development is at different stages along the way. I'll go through this slide quickly, but by no means is it a quick process. But as a center, we receive our referrals, we confirm alcohol exposure, confirm that there's concerns in multiple areas, and ultimately get consent from the legal guardian. Go through the assessment process of different domains of brain function, their physical features, and then we have follow-up services as well. So when we see a child, there's 4 areas that we look at, and we put into a 4-digit code. Now you won't see this 4-digit code reflected in any reports. It's more used for research purposes. So we'll go through each one of these, but the 4 areas are growth parameters, the facial characteristics, the brain domains, and alcohol consumption. So for growth parameters, we look at height and weight, and we're looking at the time of birth. We typically have the birth records available, but sometimes we don't. And at the time of assessment, and then we look at the percentile ranks and combine them to determine what the 4-digit code would be. So 1 would be none or normal, and then 4 being severe, which would be less than the 3rd percentile. The facial characteristics are measuring the eye, which is your palpebral fissure length, the upper lip, and your philtrum. And they're measured independently using that lip philtrum guide you can see on the far right-hand side. And then they're converted into a severity score, with 1 being absent, 2 being mild, 3 is moderate, and severe is 4. And to receive a 4, you need to have all 3 facial features. So if a child has a diagnosis of FASD with sentinel facial features, then that means that they have all 3 characteristics. These are the brain domains of function. You'll see that there's 11. In the guidelines, there's 10, but at the Manitoba FASD Center, we still look at sensory. It was removed from 2005 to 2015. We don't use it as one of the 3 domains contributing to a diagnosis, but we still assess it and we assign it, or we don't assign it in the team. So that's why it's still there as 11, and hopefully that'll change in due time. So what is needed in the brain domains is evidence of impairment in at least 3 of the brain domains at 2 standard deviations below the mean. And ideally, we want to have a comprehensive assessment in each of the categories to determine the nature of impairment. So sometimes there's differences with preschoolers. So you can see we're not going to be measuring academic achievement in a 3-year-old or affect regulation in a preschooler, but some of the domains that we would be able to comprehensively assess would be different. And sometimes there is discrepancy between 2 subdomains. For example, with receptive language and expressive language, there can be a really big split, and I'll let my partner talk about that a little bit later on. In terms of alcohol consumption history, needs to come from a reliable source or from the medical record. We look at the number and the types of drinks and the pattern of drinking and the frequency. And it's important to know that hearsay and lifestyle, other drug use, and previous alcohol history cannot be used in isolation, but it is important. It contributes to the assessment process. And based on the guidelines, they say that the threshold of alcohol exposure known to be associated with neurodevelopmental effects is 7 or more standard drinks per week, or any episode of drinking of 4 or more drinks on the same occasion, with a threshold of 2 binges throughout the length of the pregnancy. So some of you might be familiar with the old terminology of FAS and partial FAS. And so with the new guidelines now, those two categories are FASD with sentinel facial features. And then your old terminology of ARD is now FASD without sentinel facial features. Okay, so if we jump into the literature a little bit. Firstly, the guidelines in terms of sensory processing. This table is extracted directly from the guidelines, and you can see that pretty much everything on this table has sensory processing at its root, with the exception of congenital anomalies and growth. But even components of attachment are the sensory processing plays a role in that. They do say that it should be routinely assessed due to the high prevalence and importance in management planning, and that with indirect methods of assessment, information should come from multiple sources. So I'm sure many of you are aware, lots of T's here, that there's lots of literature that talks about sensory processing and prenatal alcohol exposure, like their auditory sensitivities and the tactile sensitivities and those kinds of things. But what I want you to take away from today's presentation is that there's a lot of behavioral literature, but now more recently there's a lot more literature talking about the biology of the connectivity and the tissue of the white matter, and we know that individuals with prenatal alcohol exposure have differences in their white matter. And outside of the prenatal alcohol literature, there's also studies that have looked at children with sensory processing disorders and differences in the integrity of their white matter and how it's correlated with atypical sensory behavior as well. And we know that it's related to a variety of neural networks like visual motor skills, cognition, proprioception, and attention. And it's really linked to structural brain development. So I want you to know that it's coming more biology related, which is really nice to see. And it's getting a lot more buy-in from a lot more people, which is really good. And when we were in Vancouver last year, there was a poster that I saw where they're looking at the white matter of, I can't remember what the cohort was, but as young as 2 years old, they're seeing differences in their white matter. So it's something that we can definitely assess and look at. Colley Martin et al. In 2012 talk about deficits with FASD are multifactorial, and they specifically include sensory processing in that. And more recently, there was a study that looked at including sensory response patterns in early years, and that was more predictable of ASD and other developmental diagnoses compared to when you use them for adolescents and for adults. There's also some research that looks at a child with an early binge level of exposure followed by low, moderate, or heavy later on were 2 times more likely to score in the sensation avoiding quadrants by the age of 2. And then there's also some gene expression studies that have been done that looked at if they had exposure more earlier on, they tended to be more under-responsive, and if they had mid to late exposure, they're more over-responsive. And this is just a list of some of those behavioral types of literature that we talked about. But at the bottom, you can see there's lots of difficulties with sleep, and we see that a lot. Difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, and hard to get going in the morning. And so that's all related to sensory processing. And if we're not targeting that area, then everything else, not that it falls apart during the day, but if we're not having a good sleep on a regular basis, it's hard to function at home and at school and at daycare. So if we shift gears to motor skills, based on the guidelines, an impairment is when there's a composite score below the clinical cutoff or multiple subtest scores in the assessment of fine motor skills, gross motor, graphomotor, or visual motor integration. And then tone, reflexes, balance, coordination, strength, and other abnormal findings can be considered along with that formal assessment. And soft neurological signs is kind of in that second bullet, but I put it as a third just because it's something that we frequently see in kids with prenatal alcohol exposure. So there is a lot of literature on the motor skills with prenatal alcohol exposure, so I tried to summarize it for you guys. And that with gross motor skills, we typically see differences with their balance and bilateral coordination. Those would be the top 2 for sure. And then there's some difficulties with upper limb coordination. In terms of fine motor skills, it's visual motor integration and manual dexterity and graphomotor skills. And related to the graphomotor skills, it's more particularly with the output speed. They often can do a really good job if you give them a lot of time to do it, but that's just not practical in school. And then there's also lots of evidence on the level of prenatal alcohol exposure. So the literature that talks about lower levels, there are some differences in their motor skills, but not always significant. And the moderate to heavy exposure was strongly correlated with lots of motor deficits. And the binge drinking is kind of in the middle. There's some literature that talks about how there are significant differences, and then there's another body of literature that talks about that it wasn't significant enough. So it's kind of inconclusive and needs a little bit more in that area. So after we assess sensory processing and their motor skills, look at how those two underlying performance components are impacting their self-care, their productivity, and their leisure. Just trying to figure out the why, like why can't they do these things, or why are these things challenging for them? I'll pass it over to Shelley to talk about language.
I've got a bit of a cold, so hopefully it'll sound all right here. So when we look at the literature on speech and language from way back, like FASD was first described in the literature in around 1978 or in the late 70s in that. And so when you look at research around speech and language, there's a body of literature in that's very old now, like from between 1978 to 1997. And this literature, for the most part, is very, some researchers found a connection between language and some didn't. And when you look at the research papers in that, it's mostly because they had small n's. Their n's were very small back then, and they would only sort of look at one component of language development. So they might look at like naming, for example, or they might look at grammatical errors, those sorts of things. And so some found a connection between speech and language and being prenatally exposed to alcohol, and some didn't. I think one of the most kind of remarkable studies in this sort of body of literature is by Sparks in 1984, and she was a Canadian speech-language pathologist, and she wrote a paper about how she suspected that there was a connection between language and alcohol back in 1984. And she actually has a section in her paper that talks about how you should be sensitive in interviewing the birth mom and be compassionate. And I was thinking she is so much ahead of her time, really. But yeah, so that's kind of the early literature. When we look at some of the newer stuff, and by newer, it kind of ranges from like 2000 all the way up to 2014. And actually, occupational therapy as a whole is doing way better in this area of research than speech language pathology is. There's very, very few papers written about the connection between language and prenatal alcohol exposure, which is kind of crazy because there's, like, as you're going to see as we go along here, there are lots and lots of problems with language when you've been prenatally exposed to alcohol. So these are some of the studies. I tried to sort of categorize them. One of the more interesting ones, I think, is one that was done by Oslang, looking at social communication deficits, and she actually studied children in classrooms, and she wanted to look at how often, or did they interact as often as their peers with each other, and what did their communication attempts look like. And what she found is that kids that had a diagnosis of FASD, they had more interactions with kids in their class, but the interactions weren't as, well, I wouldn't want to say meaningful, but they're more disruptive. So in other words, these kids are in classrooms and they're interacting, but they're interacting in a disruptive sort of way. And I thought that so explains like so many of the kids that we see. And often lots of people think that lots of kids that have a diagnosis that it's something else like autism. And I think those studies like this one are very, very important because there's such a big difference between that, and that drive to want to interact and be social is there. It's just that they do it inappropriately lots of times. And if you work with these kids, you see that all the time. What else could I tell you about this? Yeah, and there's lots of, like, there's some nice literature on narrative language in that. I put my study under impaired expressive and receptive language. I looked at, I think it was 130 kids, school-age kids, and in a very sort of nutshell or whatever, what I found is that 70% of them would meet the criteria of having a severe language impairment when they had a diagnosis of FASD. So by severe, that means that they'd fall below the second percentile or have a standard score of 70 or less. and 85% would have some type of language impairment. So this is one of the biggest areas that's impacted when we have prenatal alcohol exposure. Yeah. So what we did with our data is we did a retrospective chart review of close to 500 preschool assessments. So you can imagine how long it took us to pull. Our charts are purple. I'm sick of purple after about 6 months. But we actually, we looked at kids from birth to 6 years of age. This study we're talking about today is from 3 to 5'11". So we actually did another infant study that maybe we'll talk about at some other time. But and they were seen in this 16-year period of time. They had to have confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure and meet the criteria for assessment and have neurodevelopmental concerns. And then we hired a statistician in that to, of course, analyze our data. I think one of the problems that when you do a retrospective chart review over this big time span is that, as you can well imagine, our practice and how we assess children changed over time. And so like what we knew in 2000 isn't what we knew or know in 2016. And so we don't have a really consistent where they were all administered the same tests, and we have kind of this spotted data, but we still feel that it's valuable to report that. So when we look at this and we looked at our entire sample, you can see the little pie graph on the side. When we look at our preschool population, the 3 to 5 year olds, about half of them don't receive a diagnosis. So they're prenatally alcohol exposed, but they don't get a diagnosis from us. About 43% get the diagnosis without sentinel facial features. So they have no signs of being exposed to alcohol. And then 6% receive the diagnosis with FACE, or what we would consider in our old diagnostic standards as partial FAS or FAS. And so that's, I think, really important because the vast majority of these kids look completely normal and you would never be able to know looking at them. And I know Kelsey and I, like after assessing as many kids as we have, like I still don't get the facial features right. Like we'll see the kids ahead of when the doctor does and we'll think, oh, I think he's got really small eyes, and we're often wrong. Like, so it's a very sort of interesting kind of process. When you look at the second graph, we kind of divided the kids into sort of young preschoolers and older preschoolers. And you can see that this kind of changes over time in the sense that when they get a little bit older and that the diagnosis, like we're making that diagnosis a little bit more because I think that we can assess more things in that. And when you look at them combined in that, they're still a little bit with not getting a diagnosis versus FASD. Lots of these kids, like one of the reasons why we did this study is we wanted to be able to kind of figure out not just like who we can diagnose, but who's at risk in our population. Like who do we want to come back and see again because we're worried about them. And we want to know, what are we looking at? What should concern us when we can't give a diagnosis? So we're going to be able to sort of tell you a little bit about that. So the two assessment tools that I used for this study are the Preschool Language Scale 4. And for those of you who are speech pathologists or OTs and that, you're probably familiar with these tests. The Preschool Language Scale, one of the things about it is that in terms of like sort of evidence-based practice in that, the standardization on it is a little bit kind of different in that it included lots of kids with learning problems in its standardization. So it tends to kind of what I would consider inflate their scores a little bit. So they tend to do better than they actually are doing on the PLS4. And that's now becoming a little bit more prevalent in the literature in that, which is something that if you practice and use this test all the time, you kind of know. So when they kind of like get a score where they're mildly delayed, they tend to be like more impacted. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. The self-P2 is a much more, I'd say, robust test. It looks at lots of different areas of language development. And one of the reasons why, well, there's two reasons why I like this test. Both these tests are recommended in the Canadian Diagnostic Guidelines, but the reason why I like the self-P2 is that when Kelsey was talking about splits that you can get between different domains and subdomains, the self-P2 and the self-5 that I use with school age kids, it actually has part in its manual in that it tells you whether the splits are significant and rare. And so I can actually use that objective data to tell me whether or not the split between two domains is statistically significant and can be used. So for that reason, I really like this test. And I also like this test because I use the next sort of family of this test for school age kids that looks at the same thing. So I'm going to give you an example of a child that I saw who I assessed when he was 4 and at 8, and I'll show you how I can kind of look at the differences in scores in that. So those are the two tests that I used. I just got to flip to my notes here. So when we look at the PLS here, oops, I'm trying to find my thing here with my numbers on it. Sorry. Okay, so when I looked at the PLS, I had an N of 78 with this group of kids. I had 37 that were at risk and 41 that had a diagnosis of FASD. And when you look at the at-risk group, they score a little bit higher. So if you look on the left axis, it's got like if you score with a standard score of 70 or below, it's severe, moderate is between 71 and 77, and like you can read the side axes. So when they're at risk, 100 would be an average score. You can see that the at-risk group, they're not really doing very well either, but they're doing a little bit better than the kids that we diagnosed. So they're kind of hanging in there with sort of what we would call a mild to moderate delays when you look at their auditory comprehension and their expressive language and their total test score. And then the kids that get a diagnosis, their scores are more like around 72 to 71, like they're kind of 75 in there. Keeping in mind also that from what the comments that I made earlier, that this test is kind of generous and tends to score the kids doing better than they actually are. When you look at the mean score by index on the self-P2, this is an N of 164. And again, you see the same pattern where the at-risk kids do a little bit better and the kids with the diagnosis of FASD do a little bit worse. And so they actually on this test, it surprised me that they did as well as they did. But anyway, you can still see the important part of this is that they're still not doing great. Like they're not in the average range and they're still coming out sort of looking impaired. So I think that that's really important. And when you look at how many of them would meet the language domain by the criteria that Kelsey had described. So again, like just to repeat in that would be scoring a standard score of 70 or below. So below the second percentile. When we look at the PLS kids, about 80% of them have a mild, moderate, severe language impairment. And in those young years, about 50% of them would meet that language domain, which I think is really important. And with the self-P2, about 36% would meet the severe language or the language domain because they have a severe impairment. So I think that that's really important because even when they're really, really young, you can start to see that their language is falling behind, and many of them, it's way behind, even at the preschool years. And you guys would have those kids on your caseload and would know who I'm talking about. So I put this example in because it's such a great example that I kind of came across actually in February when I had this 8-year-old come for an assessment, and I realized that I had assessed him when he was 4. So this little guy, we actually received a referral on him when he was really little, like at around 2, but he got kind of lost because he moved around foster placements and that, and he never ended up coming in for his appointment. But at 2 years of age, he, on the daycare forms and home forms, they talk about how he had trouble following directions. He was easily distracted. He was really difficult to understand. At times he was aggressive when he wasn't understood, and then he needed constant redirection and supervision in the preschool years. And so when he came to see us at 4, that's the blue line that you can see. He's not doing great. Like he's got a core language score of 75, which would be moderate. and his expressive language is at 71. So he almost meets the communication domain or the expressive domain at that point in time. But what we ended up doing with this child is we deferred the diagnosis because we didn't have quite enough 3 brain domains in that, but we really thought he was at risk and we wanted to see him back at 7 to 8 years of age. So I recommended that he receive services, which he did. He was followed extensively by a school speech language pathologist. He had lots of stability. He remained in the same foster home from 3 to 4 years of age right through, and it was a long-term placement, so that was great. So when he comes back to see us at 8 years of age, which was about a year ago, you can see how his scores almost mimic exactly his scores from previously, only they're like about 10 points that they've dropped. And actually in this case, with this visit, we gave him a diagnosis of FASD and he met the language domain when he came back on his second visit. And I think that this is really important because there's a couple of things. One, it just kind of shows what we see clinically, that over time their language skills tend to worsen. And so when you see them at a point in time, very rarely do they do better. They almost always, the gap widens over time. And so it's really critical to follow them and to monitor them, even if they're kind of just sort of hanging in there. And I think this is such a great example of that, just how it almost is not predictable, but and this example, I have hundreds of examples of it. I just sort of found it interesting and remembered it. So does that kind of make sense? All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Kelsey for a second.
Okay, so for the motor skills in the study, we looked at the Berry BMI, and we also looked at the visual perception and the motor coordination subtests. I think most of you are familiar with this assessment by head nods. Yes, okay. So it's on its 6th edition, which is great, and it gives you measures from 2 right through to 100. So one thing that we didn't mention is you'll notice that we have different ends all across the board, and that's kind of why when Shelley was talking about how there's a little bit of missing data, and that just comes from going from 2000 to 2016. So when we had the statistician look at it and did the, I forget what it was called. There was some fancy term for it, not in my OT language. So that's why we have different ends all over the place. So for the VMI specifically, the N was 180. The visual perception, there was 72. And then the motor coordination, there was 70. But what I want to bring your attention to is that, again, the mean that is 100 with that red line going across. And you can see at the VMI, both groups. And remember that no diagnosis means that they didn't receive an FASD diagnosis, but they still had prenatal alcohol exposure. So you can see that both groups still had some difficulties in their visual motor integration. And so the percentages that you see on top are just, you can see that they're quite comparable across the board. But for example, the group that didn't receive a diagnosis, the 56% represents 56% of them received a standard score of 97.22 to be exact. But what I want you to take away from this slide is that if you look over to the motor coordination group, both groups, even with their confidence intervals, are still well below the mean. And there's only like a couple that went over with that in the non-diagnosed group. And the visual perception, which we see clinically, came out as a relative strength. And so what that does is that if you just did the VMI alone and you didn't get to those subtests, then you wouldn't necessarily know what part is impacting their visual motor integration skills. And so that strength and visual perception is great. We want to highlight that in the kiddos when we're done with them, seeing them. But we also don't want it to, we want to be able to use that, or it will draw up their VMI score as well. So we want to get to that motor coordination. And so our findings are consistent with some other literature that's out there. And Donnie Al in, I think this one's from 2016, yeah, they concluded that VMI and the fine motor coordination subtest should be assessed in children with PAE in the FASD diagnostic process, and that it needs to be assessed, the fine motor integration part needs to be assessed and can guide the development of therapeutic interventions and target specific areas of impairment. The MABC, which I think most of you are familiar with, is a tool that has manual dexterity, aiming and catching, and balance as components, and then it gives you a total test score in a traffic light system one being significant movement difficulty or at risk for movement or no movement difficulty at all. And I put at the bottom that qualitative observations are really important, because if we go back to the literature that we talked about at the beginning, where bilateral coordination is something that we often see with kids with prenatal alcohol exposure, and there's no measure of that in this test. And so your clinical judgment on that is really important as well. So a new N of 164 for the MABC2. It's similar in that their manual dexterity is something that they frequently have difficulty with. Their aiming and catching is often a relative strength for them in this test, and the balance tends to be quite variable. Sometimes some kids have difficulties with it and some of them have strengths. But if you look at the total test score, again, both groups are below the average, with the exception of the confidence interval is a little bit larger on the non-diagnosed group. So again, this group in Australia concluded in another study that a range of fine motor skills should be assessed, and an average motor score requires caution with interpretation because it can mask specific difficulties resulting in inaccurate diagnoses and missed opportunities for therapeutic support. So again, it's really important to look at what's the why. Why is that child having difficulty with getting dressed? Is it manual dexterity? Is it balance? Is it bilateral coordination? Is it body awareness? And so these assessments are important to look at, not just in a total test score framework, but all the individual subtests that you're looking at as well. So the tool for our study was the short sensory profile, the first version. So I'm not sure if everybody, there's some newer OTs here, so I'm not sure if you've seen the old version. It's a 38-item caregiver questionnaire, and results were typical performance, probable difference, or definite difference. And then there's the list of tactile sensitivity, taste and smell, movement, under-responsive, seek sensation, auditory filtering, low energy, weak, and visual and auditory. And then just as a reminder, like when it was revised, that's what it looks like on your right-hand side. But for the purpose of our study, we just had results with the first one. So I will disclaim that this is a very confusing slide, and it's my least favorite graph, and it needs to be changed. So I'll walk you through it. So the bold orange and purple are the non-diagnosed group, and the purple is the probable difference, and orange is definite differences in those areas. And then the ones that kind of have a bar across are the group that did receive an FASD diagnosis. And again, the purple is the probable difference and orange is the definite difference. And so what you can take away from this graph today is that the under-responsive seek sensation, the auditory filtering, and the total test score in both groups were the most impacted. And these findings have been quite similar with other studies that I've looked at, and actually a couple of the other presentations we saw in Vancouver last year, they saw similar findings. So we are starting to see a pattern with the children with alcohol exposure and their sensory patterns. So an easier way to look at this is 51% of the kids with an FASD diagnosis scored 2 standard deviations in the tactile sensitivity area. So this would represent like a low neurological threshold. They might have increased sensitivity to touch. Behaviors that you might see are that they're resistant to hugs, standing in line, holding hands. They don't like to get their hands dirty, or they might react with unexpected touch. And those are just some examples. I'm sure you see lots more on your caseloads as well. The second one is under-responsive and / seek sensation, and 76% with an FASD diagnosis scored 2 standard deviations below the mean in this area. So this would reflect a high neurological threshold, and it means that their brains need more input to meet that threshold and subsequently to facilitate their occupational performance and whatever they're doing and whatever is meaningful for them. So in this older version, we don't know if it's a high threshold with an active response or a passive response. So their behaviors may be that they're zoned out and disengaged. They might seem oblivious to what's going on around them, or they might be seeking and actively going up to meet that threshold themselves. And the auditory filtering is 69% with an FASD diagnosis scored 2 standard deviations. And so this would reflect a low neurological threshold with an increased sensitivity to stimuli, and behaviors that you may see are hyperactivity or distractible. And you need to help minimize the chances for this child's threshold to be overstimulated so that you can support their function. This looks at the sensory domain that was assigned by FASD diagnosis. And so there's a few things that I like about this slide. There was some argument when sensory was taken out that all kids with FASD have sensory issues. And we in this room have a lot of sensory preferences and differences ourselves. So you can see that in the FASD group, there was almost 70% of them did have the sensory domain assigned, which is what we would predict. But there also is about 21% of the group that didn't get the sensory domain assigned. And that's why it should be an important domain to consider, because that's why we have the 10 domains. That we often see language impairments, but not every child has the language domain assigned to them, or memory or adaptive functioning, those kinds of things. And the ability to modulate sensory information is really unique to each individual, and we know with the literature that we talked about at the beginning that it can be variable based on the timing and the quantity of alcohol exposure as well. So we'll move on to the discussion piece. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I really like this picture and saying that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows and not the flower. And so this just really reflects that ecology of human performance, that theoretical framework that we talked about at the beginning, that we're trying to find the right fit between the child and their environment. And we can't change the child, we can't change their brain. We want to try and support them and understand their strengths and understand areas where they need a little bit more support. And I think that understanding and including sensory processing as part of their profile helps give you that foundation, which is really important. Now, interpreting a sensory profile, one would argue that anybody can give a sensory profile and score it, but it requires understanding of sensory processing and its impact on performance. And a recent study that looked at caregiver reported questionnaires highlighted that it might be an under-recognized opportunity to identify neurodevelopmental and behavior concerns in infants. And we feel that that's true at the Manitoba FASD Centre as well. And so when you're looking at sensory processing, your clinical observations as an OT is really important as well. And I think seeing the physios here too, I think that your clinical observations are really important too, because I know sometimes when they're trying to do your gross motor stuff with them too, right? Sometimes it's challenging, and why is it challenging? And then your clinical analysis of the sensory profile, the results from daycares and teachers and homes, and your caregiver sensory interview. You ask some really specific questions around it, not just having the results from the profile itself. And sometimes, even as little as 3 or 4, they can give you some really interesting self-reports and things that are bugging them, and they have some good one-liners that tell us more information than they even know themselves. So when we look at targeted outcomes and early interventions, when we assess preschoolers, we know that, like we talked about, that it's multifactorial, and that sensory processing really contributes to the social skills and problem behaviors. And we know that caring for a child with FASD and neurodevelopmental difficulties, like sensory processing and executive functioning, can be really stressful and really hard on the caregivers. And that play is truly the primary occupation for a child, and it's the opportunity for caregivers to bond with that child. But we need to know how to play with that child. And if they have significant sensory differences, then we need to understand them, because sometimes parents and caregivers have sensory preferences and differences too. And so if you have a caregiver that's a seeker and you have a child that's really sensitive, then they're going to clash, and that can impact their attachment as well. And we want to try and foster that attachment and relationship first, because we know how important that is to promote ongoing development.
So in terms of my part in that, like what we or our outcome in that from our research study is that we know that when we have kids prenatally exposed to alcohol, that they're at risk for language deficits, and that the prenatal alcohol exposure puts them at significant risk for language difficulties. So I think that that's really important, because even if you have kids on your caseload where you might not have confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure, but you suspect it, those kids are at risk for language problems, and you should always be kind of thinking about whether or not they need a referral or not. The tests that we use there, they provide really good information on the language abilities of young children. And what we kind of know is that when they have poor receptive and expressive language skills, they're a strong predictor of FASD of an FASD diagnosis. And in that study from 0 to 3 that I just mentioned briefly, we know that when their receptive language in that really, really young group, when receptive language is impaired, they're almost always going to get a diagnosis of FASD somewhere along the trajectory. So it makes sense. Like if you're not understanding in that probably puts you at risk for lots of things. And so we use these results to help us determine which kids get a diagnosis when we don't have the facial characteristics present. And so when we pool all of our research together and we look at statistics in that, what we determined is that when we have sensory problems where they have a definite difference overall, when their total movement ABC score and their core language score, when those are all significantly impacted, the combination of those is a strong predictor of kids that will eventually get a diagnosis of FASD. And when we can't give that diagnosis in the preschool years, those would be the kids that we would recommend that we see down the road, and that if we're a little bit sort of unsure. So those are the very specific things that we're looking for that put those kids at risk when we're seeing them very young. And of course, like face and microcephaly, if their head measures small, those are also strong predictors of FASD. And so like when we look at evidence-based recommendations for preschool assessment, you can just kind of read this. This is what we're practicing and what we do every day in that. I think it's really neat when you work in a multidisciplinary team because, and we truly are multidisciplinary, that we can have discussions like, do we need to see this kid back? And Kelsey and I will say, well, you know what, like their language is not really good right now and they've got lots of sensory problems. Okay, well then let's like mark them to be called, or let's call the family when they're 7 and have them come back when we can look at every brain domain and do a more comprehensive assessment. So I think that that's why this study is so great, is it informs sort of our practice and helps us kind of know how we should carry out our day-to-day sort of assessments. I think that I know Kelsey didn't talk about this, but in Canada, preschool assessment for a long time has been on the back burner. Like people in diagnostic clinics across Canada don't really believe in preschool assessment because they think that children should be around 7 or 8 years of age when you can assess all different areas of brain domains. And our clinic is a little bit different because it was founded in preschool assessment. And so we're a little bit different. And we always do tons of presentations at an international FASD clinic or conference that's every 2 years in Vancouver. And finally, they started to listen to us. And we've been invited to meetings now to talk about our findings. Like they now, I think, kind of realize like, wait, maybe there is something to this. And my point sort of, or our point is that they don't just get to school and all of a sudden have problems. Like they've had the problems since they were born. And so we really want to make sure that we identify them to give them extra services and be proactive in the care that we provide for them. And it also helps us give better strategies and just supporting them better in the foster families so that we don't have breakdowns in that. So yeah, so this is really important. It's probably the most important thing, which is very discouraging that it got taken out of the diagnostic guidelines, because for us, it's a huge determinant of whether or not they get a diagnosis in lots of ways. And motor and language are also found to be important predictors, and we really support that sensory processing should be in the Canadian Diagnostic Guidelines for preschoolers so that they're, it just reflects a more integrative neurological processing approach. So does anyone have any questions? Does it make sense? Do you guys see all these preschoolers? And I think it's really important, like for speech and language, because when you see like and I know this is really hard because we all have huge caseloads, but you know, all too often than not, like I'll see an 18-month-old that gets an assessment and they're kind of just hanging in there. Like by hanging in there, I mean they're getting in the low 80s and that. And clinically what we do is like, well, they're kind of hanging in there a little bit. Like I'll get the family to call me if they have problems in that. And we kind of know that those are the kids that if you wait for it over time, you'll start to see the gradual decline in that. And so lots of the clinicians and the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority they won't see those children, but they'll monitor them and have them come back every 6 months to a year. And I get all kinds of phone calls where they'll say like, oh my gosh, like his language has tanked here and he's in real trouble in that. So it really kind of is important to follow them if you can and to provide that support, because we know in both these disciplines that over time it doesn't get better lots of times. And I know that's discouraging, like that little guy that I showed you, the comparison in time, that SLP was so discouraged when I showed her sort of, or he performed as he did, because she's like, I did all of that work and he still fell farther behind. And it's like, so I had said to her, well, if you weren't involved, you'd be even farther behind. So it's like you've kept a gap in that, and that's like really all you can do sometimes, but it's really important that they do get some of those services. Anyone else? You guys are so quiet. All right. Well, thank you for coming, and we'll be around for a couple of minutes if you have any questions. Hello, Miss Reimer. Good. Can't get this out. Where